The fog rolled in from Lake Superior that morning, thick and cold, wrapping itself around the shoreline like a shroud. It was June 27th, 1977, and inside the most magnificent mansion Minnesota had ever known, two women lay dead. One was 83 years old, smothered in her own bed with a satin pillow. The other, a nurse hired to protect her, had been beaten so savagely that her body was found at the bottom of a grand staircase, her blood pooling on marble imported from Italy decades before. The mansion was called Glensheen, and the story of what happened there that morning begins not with murder, but with a dream so extravagant, so audacious, that it would take 39 rooms, 22 fireplaces, and an ocean of money to build. Chester Adgate Congdon stood at the edge of the wilderness in 1905, staring at a stretch of lake, front land that most men would have considered worthless. Rocky, remote, exposed to the brutal winds that screamed off Lake Superior every winter, but Chester didn't see obstacles. He saw possibility. He was 51 years old, a lawyer who had made his fortune not through inheritance, but through calculated risk and relentless ambition. He had invested early in Minnesota's iron ore mining operations, specifically the Mesabi Range, which by the turn of the century was producing more iron ore than anywhere else on the planet. Chester's wealth wasn't built on blood and exploitation alone, though those elements were certainly present. It was built on timing. He understood that the Industrial Revolution demanded iron, and he positioned himself at the source. By 1905, Chester's net worth was estimated at $7 million, adjusted for inflation. That translates to roughly $230 million today. He wasn't the richest man in America, but he was close enough to taste it. And like all men of his era who had conquered industry, Chester wanted a monument. Not just a home, a declaration. He wanted to build something that would outlast him, something that would whisper to future generations, "I was here. I mattered. I won." He purchased the land, 7.5 acres of prime lake, front property in Duluth, Minnesota, for what would be the equivalent of several $1 million in modern currency. Then he hired the most expensive architect he could find, not just expensive, the best, a man named Clarence Johnston, who had designed the Minnesota State Capitol, along with countless mansions for the Gilded Age elite. Johnston's brief was simple: build the finest house in the upper Midwest, spare no expense, make it a masterpiece. Construction began in 1905 and would take 3 years to complete, 3 years of labor, of imported materials, of artisans brought in from across the world. The limestone came from Indiana, the marble from Italy, the woodwork was crafted from quartz on white oak, hand-selected and hand-carved. The house would eventually contain 39 rooms, including 7 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, and a reception hall so grand that it could host 200 guests without feeling crowded. The ceilings soared 15 feet high in some rooms, adorned with hand-painted murals and gold leaf detailing. There were Tiffany-stained glass windows, custom, designed for the home, depicting scenes of nature and prosperity. The total construction cost exceeded $850,000, the equivalent of over $27 million today. And that was just the house. The grounds were another fortune entirely. Chester hired Frederick Nutter, a landscape architect who had trained under the legendary Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who designed Central Park. Nutter transformed the rocky shoreline into an English-style garden, complete with terraced lawns, cobblestone pathways, and imported trees that had no business surviving a Minnesota winter. There was a boathouse built into the cliff face, accessible by a private staircase carved into the rock. There were fountains, pergolas, and greenhouses where rare orchids bloomed year-round, tended by a full-time staff of gardeners. The estate wasn't just extravagant. It was a universe unto itself, insulated from the chaos of the outside world. But here's what most people miss when they look at Glensheen today, when they tour its rooms and marvel at its grandeur. They see beauty, they see craftsmanship, they see history. What they don't see are the people who built it. The laborers who hauled limestone blocks in the dead of winter, the craftsmen who worked 12-hour days for wages that barely covered rent. The domestic servants, most of them immigrants who would spend the next 70 years cooking, cleaning, and maintaining a house that they could never afford to own. These people are invisible in the official history of Glensheen. Their names don't appear on plaques. Their sacrifices aren't commemorated, but they were there every single day, making Chester's dream possible. If you're still watching this, you already understand something that most people don't. The stories that matter aren't the ones we're told. They're the ones we have to dig for. And this story, the story of Glensheen, is one that most documentaries won't tell you. Not fully, not honestly. Because to understand what happened in that mansion in 1977, you have to understand what it cost to build it in the first place. Not just in dollars, in lives. Chester and his wife, Clara, moved into Glensheen in 1908 with their 7 children. The youngest, Elizabeth, was 6 years old. She would live in that house for the next 69 years. She would watch her siblings grow up, move away, and start families of their own. She would watch her father age, slowly losing his sharpness, his vitality, until he died in 1916 at the age of 63. She would watch her mother, Clara, take over the management of the estate with an iron will, transforming Glensheen into a social hub for Duluth's elite. Clara was not a passive heiress. She was a force. She hosted charity galas, suffragette meetings, and political fundraisers. She believed in using wealth as a tool for influence, and she wielded it expertly. But Elizabeth was different. Where her mother was commanding, Elizabeth was quiet, reserved. She never married, though there were suitors. She preferred books to parties, solitude to spectacle. As her siblings left to pursue their own lives, Elizabeth stayed. She became the house's caretaker, its guardian. When Clara died in 1950, Elizabeth inherited Glensheen outright, along with a trust fund worth millions. She lived there alone, except for the staff, cooks, gardeners, housekeepers who kept the estate running like a well-oiled machine. By the 1970s, Elizabeth was in her 80s, frail but still sharp. She still walked the grounds every morning, still supervised the household, still held the financial reins of the Congdon fortune. And that's when the cracks began to show, not in the house, in the family. Elizabeth had adopted 2 daughters in the 1930s, Marjorie and Jennifer. Jennifer was the quiet one, the dutiful daughter who stayed close to home and never caused trouble. Marjorie was the opposite, beautiful, charismatic, and utterly destructive. From a young age, Marjorie displayed a pattern of behavior that alarmed everyone around her. She was expelled from multiple boarding schools for lying, stealing, and manipulating other students. As a teenager, she was caught forging checks. As a young woman, she married and divorced multiple times, each marriage ending in financial ruin for her partners. She burned through money at a staggering rate, designer clothes, luxury vacations, expensive cars, all funded by her mother's trust. Elizabeth, ever the forgiving parent, kept bailing her out, kept paying the debts, kept hoping that Marjorie would change. She never did. By the 1970s, Marjorie had married a man named Roger Caldwell, a con artist with a criminal record and a gambling addiction. Together, they were a financial black hole. They lived beyond their means in Colorado, racking up hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. Adjusted for inflation, their liabilities exceeded $2 million. Creditors were circling. Foreclosure was imminent. Marjorie had one asset left, her inheritance, but there was a problem. Elizabeth was still alive, and under the terms of the trust, Marjorie wouldn't receive the full inheritance until her mother died. So the question becomes, what do you do when the only thing standing between you and solvency is an 83-year-old woman? The night of June 26, 1977, was quiet at Glensheen. Elizabeth had gone to bed early, as she always did. Her night nurse, Velma Piatilla, was on duty, checking on her periodically throughout the evening. Velma was 51 years old, a dedicated professional who had worked for the Congdon family for years. She was also a mother, a wife, and a deeply religious woman who believed in the sanctity of her work. She had no idea that someone had already entered the house, that someone had bypassed the estate's security, such as it was, and was moving through the darkened halls with a singular purpose. The details of what happened next are drawn from forensic evidence and courtroom testimony, and they are almost unbearable. Velma encountered the intruder on the staircase. There was a struggle. She was struck with a blunt object, likely a candlestick taken from one of the rooms, repeatedly with such force that her skull fractured. She fell, tumbling down the grand staircase that had been designed to impress guests, to showcase wealth and taste. Her body came to rest at the bottom, blood spreading across the marble. She was still alive, but barely. The intruder stepped over her and continued upstairs. Elizabeth was asleep in her bed when the killer entered her room. She was smothered with a satin pillow, held down until she stopped breathing. It would have taken several minutes. There were no signs of a struggle, which suggests that Elizabeth, in her frail state, was unable to fight back. When it was over, the killer went through her jewelry box, taking a few pieces, not all of them valuable, in an attempt to make the scene look like a botched robbery. Then they left, slipping out of the house the same way they had entered, disappearing into the fog. The bodies were discovered the next morning by the day staff. The scene was chaos. Police were called. The mansion, this symbol of stability, of permanence, was suddenly swarming with detectives, photographers, and reporters. The murder of Elizabeth Congdon, heiress to one of Minnesota's great fortunes, was front-page news. And almost immediately, suspicion fell on Marjorie. The investigation moved quickly. Detectives traced Roger Caldwell's movements in the days leading up to the murders. He had flown from Colorado to Minneapolis on June 26th, rented a car, and driven to Duluth. Security footage and witness testimony placed him in the area. A coin from Glensheen's collection was later found in his possession. Most damningly, a piece of jewelry stolen from Elizabeth's room was discovered in an envelope Roger had mailed to himself. The evidence was overwhelming. Roger Caldwell was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Marjorie was not charged initially, but the prosecution believed she was the architect of the crime. That Roger, quilled and desperate, had been manipulated into committing the murders by his wife, who stood to inherit millions. The trial was a media circus. Roger was convicted in 1978 and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. But in a shocking twist, he was granted a new trial on a technicality in 1982. Before the retrial could begin, he accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for time served. He was released from prison in 1983. Marjorie, meanwhile, was tried separately in 1979. Her trial was even more sensational. The prosecution painted her as a manipulative sociopath who had orchestrated her mother's murder for financial gain. The defense argued that there was no direct evidence linking her to the crime. In July 1979, Marjorie Caldwell was acquitted. The jury believed there was reasonable doubt. She walked out of the courtroom a free woman. But the story doesn't end there. Because Marjorie's life after the trial reads like a horror novel, in 1988, her third husband, Wallace Hagan, died under suspicious circumstances. His body was found in his bed, and though the official cause of death was listed as natural causes, many suspected foul play. In 1992, Marjorie was convicted of arson for burning down her home in Arizona in an insurance fraud scheme. She served 2.5 years in prison. In 2007, she was arrested again for fraud. She has spent most of her life in and out of courtrooms, always one step ahead of the law, always slipping through the cracks. Roger Caldwell, on the other hand, never recovered. He lived in isolation after his release, haunted by what he had done. In 1988, 5 years after walking out of prison, he died by suicide in his apartment in Pennsylvania. He left no note, no explanation, just silence. Before we move forward, ask yourself this: what does it mean when the cost of wealth is measured not in dollars, but in bodies? When a mansion built to celebrate life becomes a tomb, the aftermath of the murders tore the Congdon family apart. Elizabeth's other daughter, Jennifer, inherited Glensheen and immediately donated it to the University of Minnesota Duluth, with the stipulation that it be preserved as a historic site and open to the public. She wanted nothing to do with it. The house, once a symbol of prosperity and achievement, had become synonymous with greed and violence. Jennifer lived quietly for the rest of her life, avoiding the media, avoiding Marjorie. She died in 2017 at the age of 84, having spent decades trying to rebuild what her sister had destroyed. And what of Marjorie? She is still alive as of this recording, now in her 90s, living in Arizona. She has never publicly confessed to any involvement in her mother's murder. In interviews, she maintains her innocence, portraying herself as a victim of circumstance, of bad luck, of a justice system that targeted her because of her name. Some people believe her, most don't. The psychological profile that emerges from her life: chronic lying, manipulation, financial irresponsibility, a complete lack of empathy, fits almost perfectly with the clinical definition of antisocial personality disorder. But whether Marjorie is a sociopath, a criminal mastermind, or simply a deeply broken person is a question that may never be fully answered. What we do know is this: the Congdon family's wealth, accumulated over decades through mining and legal work, was not enough to protect them from the darkness that can fester within a family. Chester Congdon built Glensheen to be a legacy, a monument to his success. Instead, it became a crime scene. A cautionary tale, a reminder that no amount of money can insulate you from human nature at its worst. Today, Glensheen is one of the most visited historic sites in Minnesota. Over 100,000 people tour the mansion every year, walking through the same rooms where Elizabeth died, standing on the same staircase where Velma Piatilla took her last breath. The tours are professional, well-researched, and respectful. The guides talk about the architecture, the furnishings, the history of the Congdon family. They mention the murders, of course they have to, but they do so with a kind of detached politeness, as if discussing an unfortunate incident rather than a brutal double homicide. The house itself has been meticulously preserved. The bloodstains are long gone. The rooms are immaculate. It looks exactly as it did in 1908, frozen in time, a perfect snapshot of Gilded Age excess. But if you listen closely, if you pay attention to the spaces between the words, you can still feel the weight of what happened there. The tragedy isn't just that two women were murdered, it's that their deaths were so preventable. Elizabeth Congdon was a kind woman, by all accounts generous to a fault. She enabled her daughter's destructive behavior for decades, always hoping that love and money could fix what was broken. She was wrong, and it cost her everything. There's a broader lesson here, one that extends far beyond the walls of Glensheen. The Gilded Age, for all its opulence and innovation, was built on a foundation of inequality. The mansions, the estates, the fortunes, they were made possible by the labor of people who would never see a fraction of that wealth. Chester Congdon's fortune came from iron ore mining, an industry that employed thousands of workers in conditions that were often brutal and dangerous. These men worked 12-hour shifts underground, breathing in dust that would eventually destroy their lungs, all for wages that barely kept their families fed. When Chester looked at his mansion, he saw success. When those miners looked at it, if they ever got close enough to see it, they saw the physical manifestation of their exploitation. And yet we're drawn to these stories, aren't we? We tour the mansions, we read the histories, we watch documentaries about the lives of the ultra-wealthy. There's something seductive about it, the grandeur, the ambition, the sheer scale of what money can buy. But seduction is a trap, because the more we romanticize the Gilded Age, the more we forget the cost. Not just the financial cost, but the human one, the workers, the servants, the families torn apart by greed. The women like Velma Piatilla, who went to work one night and never came home. If you've made it this far, if you're still here, it's because you understand that these stories matter. Not as entertainment, as warnings. The world we live in now isn't so different from the Gilded Age. Wealth inequality is at levels not seen since the 1920s. Billionaires build mansions and private islands while millions struggle to afford rent. The names have changed, but the dynamics haven't, and stories like Glensheen remind us of what happens when wealth becomes the only thing that matters. When family ties are reduced to asset allocation, when human life becomes collateral damage in the pursuit of solvency. There's something else worth examining here, the psychology of entitlement. Marjorie Caldwell grew up in a world of extraordinary privilege. She lived in a mansion worth tens of millions of dollars. She attended the finest schools. She wore designer clothes and traveled the world. But none of it was ever enough. The psychological literature on this phenomenon is extensive. Children raised in extreme wealth often develop what researchers call affluenza, a warped sense of reality where material possessions become the primary measure of worth, and consequences become abstract concepts that apply to other people. Marjorie exhibited these traits from childhood. She lied, stole, and manipulated without apparent remorse because in her mind the rules didn't apply to her. She was a Congdon, she was entitled to the wealth, and when that wealth was threatened, when her inheritance was delayed by the inconvenient fact that her mother was still alive, she acted. Or at least, that's the theory. The prosecution never definitively proved that Marjorie ordered the murders. Roger Caldwell took that secret to his grave, but the circumstantial evidence is damning. The financial motive was clear. The timing was suspicious. And Marjorie's behavior after the murders, her lack of grief, her immediate attempts to access the estate's assets, suggested a woman who saw her mother's death not as a tragedy, but as a solution to a liquidity crisis. The trial itself revealed the mechanisms of power and privilege in ways that are deeply uncomfortable to examine. Marjorie had access to the best legal defense money could buy. Her attorneys painted her as a grieving daughter, wrongly accused by a justice system looking for a scapegoat. They pointed out that no physical evidence linked her to the crime scene. They emphasized reasonable doubt. And it worked. The jury acquitted her. Meanwhile, Roger Caldwell, the actual killer, the man who strangled an 83-year-old woman and beat a nurse to death, served less than 5 years in prison. The disparity is staggering. It's a reminder that in America, justice is not blind, it's expensive. Let's talk about Velma Piatila for a moment, because her story deserves more than a footnote. Velma was 51 years old when she died. She had spent her entire adult life working as a nurse, caring for people in their most vulnerable moments. She was married to a railroad worker. They had a modest home, a modest life. She wasn't rich. She didn't have a trust fund or a mansion. What she had was a work ethic, a sense of duty, and a belief that her job mattered. On the night she died, she was doing exactly what she had been hired to do, protecting Elizabeth Congdon. She confronted an intruder not because she was reckless, but because she was brave, and it cost her everything. Velma's family received no inheritance, no trust fund, no monument. Her death was treated as a side note in the larger narrative of the Congdon murders. But here's the truth. Velma Piatila was a hero. She died trying to stop a crime, trying to save a life. And the fact that her name is barely remembered, that her sacrifice is overshadowed by the drama of the Congdon family, is its own kind of injustice. If that injustice makes you feel something, if it makes you pause, if it makes you angry, that pause matters. That's the signal that you're paying attention, that you're not here for spectacle. You're here because these stories cut deeper than headlines. The financial legacy of the Congdon fortune is complex. At the time of Chester's death in 1916, his estate was valued at approximately $3 million, roughly $95 million in today's currency. He had structured his wealth carefully, establishing trusts for his children designed to provide income while preserving the principal. Elizabeth, as the primary inheritor of Glensheen and its associated assets, managed the estate conservatively. She lived well, but not lavishly. She supported charities, she maintained the house, she employed a staff. By the time of her death in 1977, the estate was still worth millions, though the exact figure was never publicly disclosed. Marjorie's portion of the inheritance, which she eventually received after years of legal battles, was substantial. Estimates suggest she inherited between $2 and $4 million, equivalent to roughly $10 to $20 million today. She burned through it in less than a decade. Fraud, arson, bad investments, gambling, the money that Chester had spent a lifetime accumulating, that Elizabeth had spent decades preserving, was gone. Dissipated, wasted. This is the other tragedy of Glensheen, not just the violence, but the waste. Generational wealth, when handled responsibly, can be a force for good. It can fund education, support the arts, provide stability for future generations. The Congdon fortune had that potential. Instead, it became fuel for destruction. Marjorie's financial recklessness wasn't just about her. It was a betrayal of everyone who had worked to build that wealth, including the laborers, the miners, the servants. Their contributions were erased not by time but by greed. There's a psychological dimension to this that's worth exploring. Research into inherited wealth shows that the third generation, the grandchildren of the fortune's original creator, often struggle the most. They didn't build the wealth, they didn't watch it grow. It's simply there, an abstract concept, a number in a bank account. This detachment can lead to either extreme frugality or extreme recklessness. Marjorie fell into the latter category. She had no connection to the iron ore mines, to the years of legal work, to the careful investments that had built her family's fortune. To her, money was simply something that appeared when she needed it, provided by the ever-forgiving Elizabeth. When that pipeline was threatened, when the trust structure meant she had to wait for her full inheritance, she couldn't accept it. And that inability to accept delay, to tolerate even temporary inconvenience, led directly to murder. Let's consider the house itself for a moment, because Glensheen is more than just a crime scene. It's a physical representation of a particular moment in American history. The Gilded Age was a time of unprecedented wealth accumulation, but also unprecedented inequality. The gap between the rich and the poor was vast, and it was visible. Men like Chester Congdon built palaces while workers lived in tenements. The elite hosted lavish parties while children worked in factories. And yet, there was a belief, a hope, that this wealth would eventually benefit everyone, that the industrialists, through their success, would create jobs, drive innovation, and lift the entire nation. Some called it trickle-down prosperity, others called it exploitation. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. Chester Congdon did create jobs. His investments in iron ore mining employed thousands. His legal work helped establish the frameworks that allowed industry to flourish. But those benefits came at a cost. The workers who mined the ore faced danger every day. The families who depended on those jobs had no safety net, no health insurance, no retirement plans. If a miner was injured or killed, his family was left destitute. This was the bargain of the Gilded Age, prosperity for some, precarity for most. And Glensheen stands as a monument to that bargain. It's beautiful, it's historic, it's also a reminder of what we choose to preserve and what we choose to forget. When you tour the mansion, you see the imported marble, the Tiffany glass, the gold leaf. You don't see the miners. You don't see their families. You don't see the full accounting of what that wealth cost. The murder trials in the late 1970s and early 1980s captivated Minnesota and much of the nation. It wasn't just the brutality of the crimes, it was the setting. The idea that such violence could occur in a place like Glensheen, a house built to represent stability, tradition, and civilized living, was deeply unsettling. It shattered the illusion that wealth could protect you from the darkest aspects of human nature. In fact, the trials revealed the opposite, that wealth could attract that darkness, could amplify it, could turn family members into adversaries in a zero-sum game for control of assets. The media coverage was relentless. Newspapers ran daily updates. Television crews camped outside the courthouse. Marjorie became a tabloid fixture, photographed in expensive clothes, always impeccably dressed, always projecting an image of innocence. The contrast between her public persona and the accusations against her was stark. How could this elegant, well-spoken woman be capable of orchestrating such a crime? The cognitive dissonance was intentional. Marjorie understood the power of image, the way appearance could create doubt. And it worked. The jury acquitted her, but public opinion was less forgiving. In Duluth, in Minnesota, Marjorie Caldwell became a pariah. People believed she was guilty, regardless of what the jury decided. She moved away, changed her name multiple times, but the reputation followed her. Every subsequent crime, the arson, the fraud, only reinforced the narrative that she had gotten away with murder. And in a very real sense, she had. Roger Caldwell's trajectory after his release is a study in guilt and disintegration. He moved to Pennsylvania, took a low-wage job, lived in a small apartment. He avoided the press, avoided contact with anyone from his past. Friends from that period described him as a broken man, haunted by nightmares, unable to sleep. He drank heavily. He talked about Elizabeth, about Velma, about what he had done. In 1988, unable to live with himself any longer, he ended his life. His suicide note, according to those who saw it, was brief. "I didn't want to do it." That single sentence contains multitudes. It suggests coercion, manipulation, a weak man pushed into an act he didn't have the strength to refuse. It doesn't absolve him. He committed the murders, he is responsible, but it adds a layer of tragedy to an already tragic story. Roger Caldwell was a criminal, but he was also a victim, caught in the gravitational pull of a woman who saw him as a tool, a means to an end. If you're still watching this, you know that stories like these don't offer easy answers. They don't resolve neatly. They linger like fog on the lake, obscuring as much as they reveal, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the value in examining Glensheen isn't in reaching a verdict, but in grappling with the questions it raises. Questions about wealth, about family, about the lengths people will go to preserve their status, their lifestyle, their sense of self. There's a philosophical angle here that's worth considering. The concept of blood money, wealth that is tainted by violence or exploitation, is ancient. In many cultures, such wealth is considered cursed, destined to bring ruin to those who possess it. The Congdon fortune wasn't built on violence in the traditional sense. Chester didn't rob banks or run a criminal empire. But the iron ore industry, like most extractive industries of the Gilded Age, operated with a ruthlessness that left scars. Environmental devastation, worker exploitation, political corruption. The wealth was legal, but it wasn't clean. And perhaps that's the curse of Glensheen, not a supernatural curse, but a structural one. Wealth built on inequality, on the backs of the invisible, carries within it the seeds of its own destruction. It attracts the greedy, the desperate, the immoral. It creates fault lines within families, turning love into suspicion, turning inheritance into a motive for murder. The mansion didn't kill Elizabeth and Velma, but the money did, or more precisely, the promise of money, the idea that financial security was worth any cost, even the cost of human life. Let's talk about legacy for a moment, because Chester Congdon's legacy is complicated. On one hand, he was a successful businessman, a philanthropist, a family man who built something extraordinary. On the other hand, the thing he built became the site of a tragedy that overshadowed all his accomplishments. When people think of Glensheen today, they don't think of Chester's vision. They think of the murders. The house that was supposed to immortalize him instead became synonymous with greed and violence. Is that fair? Probably not. Chester had nothing to do with what Marjorie did 60 years after his death, but legacy isn't about fairness. It's about narrative, about the stories that get told and retold. And the story of Glensheen, whether Chester would have wanted it or not, is a cautionary tale about the dangers of wealth without wisdom, of ambition without ethics. Elizabeth's legacy is different. She was, by all accounts, a decent person, kind, generous, naive perhaps, but not malicious. She loved her daughters, even when one of them was destroying everything she had built. She believed in redemption, in second chances, in the power of forgiveness. Those beliefs cost her her life, and yet there's something noble in that. She could have cut Marjorie off, disinherited her, let her face the consequences of her actions. She didn't. She kept hoping, kept trying, kept believing that her daughter could change. Was that hope foolish? In retrospect, yes, but it was also deeply human. We want to believe that the people we love are capable of change, that beneath the dysfunction and the lies, there's something salvageable. Elizabeth held onto that belief until the very end, and in a strange way that makes her death even more tragic. She didn't die because she was cruel or greedy. She died because she was too kind, too trusting, too willing to give one more chance. Velma's legacy is the simplest and the most profound. She was a working-class woman who did her job, who showed up every night, who cared for a woman she barely knew because that's what she was paid to do. She didn't owe Elizabeth anything beyond her professional duties, but when danger came, she didn't run. She confronted it, she fought, she died defending someone else. If that's not heroism, then the word has no meaning. These three women, Elizabeth, Velma, and Marjorie, represent three different responses to the world of wealth and power. Elizabeth inherited it and tried to manage it responsibly. Velma existed on the periphery of it, serving it without ever truly accessing it. Marjorie consumed it, burned through it, destroyed everything around her in pursuit of more, and in the end, the system that created that wealth couldn't protect any of them. Not the heiress, not the nurse, not even the destroyer. There's a scene I want you to imagine. It's the morning after the murders. The police are swarming Glensheen. The staff, the gardeners, the cooks, the housekeepers are standing outside, watching. They've worked in this house for years, some of them for decades. They've cleaned these rooms, polished this marble, tended these gardens. And now police tape surrounds the estate, detectives are photographing bloodstains, reporters are asking questions. The world they knew, the carefully maintained facade of order and elegance, has collapsed. What are they thinking in that moment? Are they shocked? Probably. Are they surprised? Maybe not, because the staff, the invisible people who keep estates like Glensheen running, they see everything. They know the family secrets, the tensions, the dysfunction. They've watched Marjorie burn through money, watched Elizabeth cover for her, watched the slow-motion disaster unfold. They couldn't stop it. It wasn't their place, but they knew it was coming. And now, standing outside the house they've spent years maintaining, they're witnesses to the inevitable conclusion. Their stories were never told. They were interviewed by police, gave their statements, and then disappeared back into obscurity. But their perspective is crucial, because they understood something that the family didn't, that no amount of wealth can buy peace. That a mansion is just a building, and a family is just people, and people are capable of terrible things, regardless of how much money they have. The years following the trials saw Glensheen undergo a transformation. Jennifer Congdon Johnson, Elizabeth's other daughter, donated the estate to the University of Minnesota Duluth in 1979. Her reasoning was simple. She didn't want it. She didn't want to live in a house where her mother had been murdered. She didn't want the responsibility of maintaining it, of managing the memories, but she also didn't want it to be torn down, to be erased. So she gave it away with the stipulation that it be preserved as a historic site, that the public be allowed to tour it, to learn from it. The university accepted the donation, and Glensheen opened to the public in 1979. The tours were initially controversial. Some people thought it was ghoulish, turning a crime scene into a tourist attraction. Others argued that the historical value of the estate outweighed the tragedy, that Glensheen represented an important piece of Minnesota's history, and that history should be accessible. The university sided with the latter argument. They hired historians, trained tour guides, and created a program that emphasized the architecture, the craftsmanship, and the Congdon family's contributions to the region. The murders were mentioned, but they weren't the focus. Over time, public perception shifted. Glensheen became one of the most popular historic sites in the state. People came for the history, for the beauty, and yes, for the notoriety. The estate generates significant revenue for the university, revenue that funds scholarships, research, and educational programs. In that sense, Chester Congdon's dream has been partially realized. His house has become a legacy, though not in the way he imagined. But there's a tension here that's never fully resolved. Glensheen is both a celebration of Gilded Age achievement and a reminder of Gilded Age excess. It's both a beautiful historic home and the site of a brutal double murder. Visitors come with different expectations, different lenses through which they view the estate. Some see art, some see history, some see crime. All of those perspectives are valid, and none of them are complete. There's also a socioeconomic dimension to the tours that's rarely discussed. The price of admission is modest, but it's not free. The visitors are predominantly middle class, predominantly white, predominantly educated. They have the time, the resources, and the interest to spend an afternoon touring a mansion. The descendants of the miners who built Chester Congdon's fortune, the families of the immigrants who staffed the estate, they're less likely to visit. Not because they're not interested, but because historic tourism is a luxury, one that assumes you have disposable income and leisure time. The irony is thick. The people whose labor made Glensheen possible are largely excluded from its commemoration. If you're still here, still listening, you already know this isn't just a story about one mansion. It's a story about all of them. About every Gilded Age estate, every family fortune, every legacy built on the premise that wealth equals worth. These stories are uncomfortable because they force us to confront the contradictions at the heart of the American dream. We celebrate success, but we ignore the cost. We admire ambition, but we look away from exploitation. We build monuments, but we forget the names of the people who laid the stones. The psychological aftermath of the murders extended far beyond the immediate family. Duluth, a city that had always taken pride in Glensheen as a symbol of its prosperity, was traumatized. The idea that such violence could occur in their most beloved landmark was a kind of civic betrayal. People who had attended parties at the estate, who had admired it from the outside, who had felt a sense of ownership over it as a community treasure, now saw it as tainted. The murders didn't just destroy a family. They altered the identity of an entire city. And yet, cities are resilient. Narratives shift. Over time, Duluth reclaimed Glensheen not by erasing the murders, but by integrating them into a more complex story. The estate became a symbol not just of wealth and beauty, but of the human capacity for both creation and destruction. It became a place where you could learn about architecture and also about psychology, about history and also about crime. That nuance, that willingness to hold multiple truths simultaneously, is rare in historic preservation. Most sites either sanitize the past or sensationalize it. Glensheen, to its credit, has tried to do neither. Marjorie Caldwell's life after the trial is a case study in the limits of justice. She committed arson in 1992, burning down a house she owned in Ajo, Arizona, in an attempt to collect the insurance money. The scheme was obvious, amateurish, and she was quickly caught. She served time, was released, and continued her pattern of fraud and deception. In 2007, she was charged with theft after forging signatures to access funds that didn't belong to her. She pleaded guilty, received probation, and disappeared from public view. The question that haunts many who followed her story is simple: why wasn't she stopped sooner? The answer is complicated. Marjorie was skilled at manipulation, at presenting herself as a victim, at exploiting the gaps in the legal system. She also had resources, money from her inheritance, access to lawyers, the ability to move frequently and reinvent herself. Most importantly, she was acquitted of the murders. That acquittal, regardless of public opinion, meant she had no murder conviction on her record. And without that, prosecutors in subsequent cases couldn't reference the Glensheen murders as part of a pattern. Each crime was treated in isolation, and each time Marjorie managed to minimize the consequences. This is the other tragedy of the Glensheen case. The legal system, designed to protect the innocent, also protected the guilty. Marjorie's acquittal was procedurally correct. The prosecution couldn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that she had orchestrated the murders. But the outcome was substantively unjust. A woman who almost certainly conspired to kill her own mother walked free and went on to commit more crimes. The system worked, and the system failed simultaneously. Roger's suicide in 1988 closed one chapter of the story, but it opened another question: what does guilt look like? Roger lived with the knowledge of what he had done for 5 years after his release. He wasn't in prison, but he wasn't free either. He was trapped by his own conscience, by the memory of the women he had killed, by the realization that he had destroyed his own life for a woman who had discarded him the moment he was no longer useful. His death was a form of self-imposed justice, an acknowledgement that some acts are unforgivable even if the law disagrees. There's a philosophical tradition that asks whether punishment serves to rehabilitate, to deter, or simply to exact vengeance. Roger's case suggests a fourth possibility: that punishment is sometimes internal, self-inflicted, and far more severe than any court could impose. He couldn't live with himself, and in the end he chose not to. The estate of Elizabeth Congdon was eventually settled after years of legal wrangling. Jennifer received her portion, which she used to support various charities and educational initiatives. Marjorie received hers, and, as mentioned, burned through it with astonishing speed. The rest was divided among other family members and absorbed into the trust structures that Chester had established decades earlier. The money, in a sense, survived, but the family did not. The Congdon name, once synonymous with success and philanthropy, became synonymous with murder. That's the real cost of what happened at Glensheen, not the financial loss, but the reputational one. The erasure of decades of good work by a single act of violence. Let's return to the house one last time. Glensheen stands today much as it did in 1908. The rooms are preserved, the gardens are maintained, the tours continue. Visitors walk through the halls, admire the craftsmanship, take photos. The guides tell the story, the history, the architecture, the tragedy. And then the visitors leave, stepping back out into the present, carrying with them whatever lessons they choose to take. But the house remains. It remains as a monument to ambition, to beauty, to the Gilded Age's boundless optimism. It also remains as a crime scene, a site of unspeakable violence, a reminder that no amount of wealth can protect you from the darkness within your own family. These two realities coexist, not in contradiction, but in tension, and that tension is what makes Glensheen so compelling, so haunting. There's a broader lesson here about how we remember the past. We tend to compartmentalize. We create narratives that are clean, that fit neatly into categories of good and bad, hero and villain, success and failure. But history is messier than that. Chester Congdon was both a visionary and a capitalist who profited from the labor of exploited workers. Elizabeth Congdon was both a kind woman and an enabler of her daughter's destructive behavior. Marjorie Caldwell is both a criminal and a product of a system that failed to give her the psychological help she needed. These contradictions don't cancel each other out. They coexist, and that's the truth that Glensheen forces us to confront. The same house that represents architectural achievement also represents moral failure. The same fortune that funded philanthropy also funded murder. The same family that built a legacy also destroyed it. We want history to be simpler than it is. We want monuments to be pure, legacies to be untainted. But they never are. They're always complex, always contested, always open to reinterpretation. If this made you pause, that pause matters. If it made you question the stories we tell about wealth, about success, about the American dream, then this wasn't just a story. It was an invitation to look deeper, to question more, to refuse the easy narratives. These stories take time to research, time to tell, time to understand, and your presence here, your attention, makes them possible. So what do we do with a place like Glensheen? Do we tear it down, erase the memory, start fresh? That's one option. But it feels like a kind of forgetting, a refusal to grapple with the full complexity of what happened there. Do we preserve it exactly as it was, turning it into a shrine to the past? That's another option. But it risks romanticizing the Gilded Age, glossing over the exploitation and inequality that made such places possible. The University of Minnesota Duluth has tried to navigate a middle path. They preserve the house, but they also tell the story, all of it, including the uncomfortable parts. They acknowledge the murders, they discuss the family dynamics, they don't shy away from the questions of wealth and power. It's not a perfect approach, but it's an honest one, and honesty, when it comes to history, is rare. There's a final question worth asking. What does Glensheen teach us about the present? We live in a second Gilded Age, a time of wealth concentration not seen since the 1920s. Billionaires build compounds and private islands. Wealth inequality is at historic levels. The gap between the ultra-rich and everyone else is vast and growing. And the dynamics that led to tragedy at Glensheen, greed, entitlement, the belief that wealth places you above the rules, those dynamics are still with us. We see it in corporate scandals, in political corruption, in families torn apart by inheritance disputes. The specifics change, but the patterns remain. Wealth, without a moral framework, without a sense of responsibility, becomes destructive. It attracts the worst impulses in human nature. It corrodes relationships. It turns family members into adversaries. And sometimes it leads to violence. Glensheen is a warning. It's a reminder that the accumulation of wealth is not, in itself, an accomplishment. What matters is how that wealth is used, how it's managed, how it shapes the lives of the people who possess it and the people who don't. Chester Congdon built a mansion to showcase his success, but his success couldn't protect his daughter from herself, couldn't prevent the murders, couldn't preserve the family legacy. The mansion stands, but the family is broken. The wealth remains, but the trust is gone. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson. That buildings last longer than families. That fortunes outlive the people who create them. That legacy isn't something you build. It's something that gets built around you after you're gone, by people who interpret your life through the lens of their own values and priorities. Chester wanted to be remembered as a successful businessman, a family man, a pillar of the community. He is remembered instead as the man whose house became a crime scene. Is that fair? No, but it's the truth. And truth, as uncomfortable as it is what we're left with. Before we end, consider this. Every mansion has a story. Every fortune has a cost. The question is whether we're willing to look beyond the marble and the gold leaf, beyond the carefully curated tours and the sanitized histories, to see the full picture. To see the workers who built it, the families who maintained it, the victims of its wealth, and the lessons embedded in its walls. Glensheen is still there, on the shores of Lake Superior, open to the public, waiting. It's both a monument and a warning, a celebration and a tragedy. It's a place where the Gilded Age's grandest dreams and darkest realities collide. And it's a reminder that no matter how much money you have, no matter how grand your ambitions, you can't escape the consequences of your choices. You can't outrun your family's dysfunction. You can't build walls high enough to keep out the darkness. The fog still rolls in from the lake, just as it did that morning in 1977. The house still stands, impervious to time, indifferent to tragedy. And somewhere in the gaps between the tour groups and the historical markers, the ghosts of Elizabeth and Velma linger, not as supernatural entities, but as reminders, as questions that have no easy answers, as evidence that the cost of wealth is sometimes measured in lives. If you've stayed until the end, if you're still here, it means something. It means you're not looking for easy answers or simple stories. You're looking for truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it complicates the narratives we've been taught to accept. That search matters, that willingness to sit with complexity, with contradiction, with the messy reality of history. That's what separates understanding from consumption. Share this if it changed how you see wealth, how you see legacy, how you see the stories we tell ourselves about success. And if you're ready for more stories that refuse to look away, that dig deeper than the surface, that honor the invisible people history forgot, you know where to find them. Not because I'm asking, because these stories need to be told, and you're part of the reason they can be.